In 301 AD, the most powerful man on earth made it a crime to sell bread at the wrong price. The penalty was death. He carved his law into stone. He posted it in 42 cities across the empire. He listed over 1,200 items: grain, wine, beef, linen, hobnails, the wage of a sewer cleaner, the fee of a lawyer. Every price, notch, fixed by imperial decree, enforced by execution, and within months the markets vanished. Not because the traders were executed, because they stopped coming. A baker who could not cover the cost of his flour had one rational choice: close the stall, hide the goods, wait. And so the markets emptied, and the people who had no bread before the edict had less bread after it. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who did this was Emperor Diocletian, who had spent 17 years pulling the Roman Empire back from the edge of total collapse. He had reorganized the army, restructured the government, stabilized the borders. Was not a fool. He was not ignorant. Understood money. He had already tried to reform the currency before he tried to fix the prices. But he did it anyway. Here is the question that nobody who tells you this story ever answers. If Diocletian knew that the coin was the problem, why did he blame the merchants? And if he knew the merchants were not the problem, why did he order their execution? The answer to that question is the story of every financial crisis you have ever lived through. It is never about the price. It is about who controls the money and what they need you to believe about why that money is failing. I am the money architect. This channel exists to show you exactly how these things happen. Not the version that blames the greedy trader or the ignorant consumer. Forensic version. One with the numbers, the dates, and the named decision-makers who were in the room when it went wrong. The Edict on Maximum Prices is the oldest price control failure in recorded history. 1700 years later, every government that has tried the same thing has produced the same result. Here is the question for you. Leave your answer in the comments below. You have lived through a period of serious inflation. When your government told you the cause was corporate greed, did you believe them? Understand what Diocletian was trying to do in 301 AD, you need to understand what the Roman Empire had been through in the 66 years before he took power. In 235 AD, the last emperor of the Severan dynasty was assassinated. What followed was 50 years of near-continuous civil war. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century. You can call it what it actually was: a state that had lost control of its money. In those 50 years, more than 20 emperors rose and fell. Many lasted less than a year. Several were murdered by their own troops within months of taking power. Each new emperor had the same problem the moment he seized the throne. He needed to pay his army. The army was the only reason he was emperor. If he stopped paying, the army would make someone else emperor instead. Pay attention to this number. The silver denarius had been Rome's reliable currency for over 4 centuries. Under Augustus, it was 98% pure silver. By the reign of Gallienus in 260 AD, it was 2%, not 98. Mine too. Coin that had built the Roman economy was now a bronze disc with a thin silver wash. It was worthless the moment anyone touched it. When the coin is worthless, prices rise to compensate. This is not greed. This is arithmetic. A merchant who accepts 50 bronze coins for a sack of grain and then finds those 50 coins will not buy a half sack of grain, the following week has no choice. He raises his price, or he stops selling grain entirely. In Roman Egypt, a measure of wheat that sold for 6 drachmas in the 1st century AD reached 200 drachmas by 276 AD. That is a 33-fold increase in under 2 centuries. Most of that increase came in the 50 years of the crisis, not gradually. In lurches, as each debasement hit the market and merchants recalculated what their coins were actually worth. Diocletian came to power in 284 AD. Was a soldier from the Balkans, the son of a freed slave, a man who had climbed through the ranks of the Roman army on competence alone. He looked at the empire and understood what had happened. The coin had been destroyed. The state had destroyed it. Every emperor who needed a quick payment to a loyal general had shaved a little more silver from the denarius, and the accumulated damage over 50 years was now catastrophic. I tried to fix it. Between 284 and 301 AD, Diocletian launched a series of monetary reforms. He introduced new coins. The argentius, a genuine silver coin, intended to restore confidence in Roman currency, reformed the gold aureus, restructured the denominational system. I was doing, in the 3rd century, what central banks claim to do today, restoring monetary credibility through institutional reform. It did not work. The new coins entered a market that had already adapted to the old debased ones. People hoarded the good coins and spent the bad ones. Argentius vanished from circulation almost immediately, and the inflation continued. Here is what is actually happening. Diocletian had stabilized the political situation. I had reorganized the army. He had restructured the state. But he had also massively expanded the state. He increased the number of Roman provinces from 40 to 105. Each new province needed administrators, soldiers, tax collectors, and judges, all of them paid by the imperial treasury. He had multiplied the number of high-salaried officials 5-fold. He had built the machine that was creating the problem he was trying to solve. And by 301 AD, with the monetary reforms having failed to stop inflation, Diocletian made a different choice. He would not fix the money. He would fix the prices. The Edict on maximum prices was issued between November and December of 301 AD. Its full Latin title was the Edictum de Praetis Rerum Venalium, the Edict on the Prices of Goods for Sale. Read the preamble, and you will recognize the language immediately. Diocletian did not say, "We have debased the currency for 60 years, and the consequences are now unbearable." I said, "Wicked men are exploiting the people." I said, "Greedy traders and profiteering merchants are driving prices beyond the reach of ordinary Romans and honest soldiers." He said the crisis was a problem not merely of economics, but of human greed. The edict was presented as an act of justice, and then it listed 1,200 price caps. Grain, wine, olive oil, pork, beef, venison, salt fish, linen, wool, silk. The wage of a farm laborer, a carpenter, a sewer cleaner, a teacher of arithmetic, a lawyer pleading a case. The fee for clipping a mule's hoofs. The rate for a scribe writing first-quality text. 25 denarii per 100 lines. It was inscribed on stone slabs and posted in 42 locations across the empire, concentrated in the east. Fragments survive today. The most complete is from Aphrodisias in Asia Minor, now in western Turkey. Every item had a maximum price. No item could be sold above it. Violators faced execution, not a fine, not confiscation, death. The same penalty applied to the buyer who paid above the legal price. To the merchant who refused to bring goods to market at all, hoarding them against the day the controls would be lifted. Here is the part nobody tells you. The prices in the edict were, in many cases, already below the market rate by the time the edict was published. Not because Diocletian set them unreasonably low, because between the moment the edict was drafted and the moment it was posted on stone, inflation had continued. The coin had continued to lose value. By the time a merchant in Aphrodisias read the legal price for a measure of grain on the stone tablet in the public square, that price was already a loss. So what do? You do not bring the grain to the public square. You move it somewhere the stone tablet cannot find it. You trade it with a neighbor. You barter it for something you need. You hide it in your warehouse and wait. Or you sell it quietly at a price that reflects what the grain actually costs to produce and transport. And you take the risk that no informer is watching. Lactantius was a Roman rhetorician who served at Diocletian's own court. I later wrote De Mortibus Persecutorum, on the deaths of the persecutors, the most detailed eyewitness account of what followed the edict. His words have survived 1700 years. They are precise. Much blood was shed for the veriest trifles. Men were afraid to expose aught to sale, and the scarcity became more excessive and grievous than ever, until in the end the ordinance, after having proved destructive to multitudes, was from mere necessity abrogated. Cancelled, rescinded, not because it was enforced and failed, because it could not be enforced at all. Marked is not a building. You cannot post guards at every door. The market is every transaction between every buyer and every seller across a territory the size of Western Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Diocletian had posted price caps on stone in 42 cities. The Roman Empire had thousands of markets in villages, in farms, in river ports, on mountain roads. The edict reached a fraction of them. The rest simply adapted around it, and the gold price continued rising. After the edict, the price of 1 pound of gold in denarii rose by 250%. Not fell, rose. The edict designed to stop inflation accelerated it, because it destroyed the confidence of anyone with anything to sell. But it gets worse. Diocletian abdicated in May 305 AD. By then, enforcement of the edict had effectively collapsed across most of the empire. 4 years, the most ambitious price control in recorded history, lasted in functional terms approximately 4 years. And in those 4 years, Roman market networks that had taken centuries to build contracted. Traders who had been executed could not be replaced. Trust between buyer and seller, already eroded by decades of currency debasement, was now poisoned further by the knowledge that any transaction could end in violence. Diocletian was not the first ruler to try this, and he was not even the first Roman emperor. And this is where the story changes, because the history of price controls is not a history of experiments that failed due to bad execution. It is a history of a single mechanism, repeated across 4,000 years, producing the same outcome every time. The mechanism is this: a government debases its currency, or spends beyond its means, or fails to maintain the conditions that allow production to function. Prices rise. The government blames the people who are quoting the prices. The government caps the prices. Supply disappears. Prices rise further, this time underground. The cap is abandoned. This is not theory. It is a documented sequence. In 40 centuries of wage and price controls, economists Robert Schettinger and Eamon Butler surveyed the record from ancient Egypt in 2000 BC to the United States in the 1970s. Their conclusion was exact. There is not a single episode in recorded history in which price controls stopped inflation or cured a shortage. Not one. 4,000 years. Not once. Look at the specifics. In ancient Egypt under Pharaoh Horemheb, roughly 1319 BC, officials fixed grain prices to prevent profiteering during a supply crisis. Result was that grain disappeared from official markets. Farmers sold privately. The official markets reported compliance. The population went hungry. In Hammurabi's Babylon, around 1754 BC, the Code of Hammurabi set maximum prices for goods and labor. Merchants who violated the code faced punishment. The code survived. The market adapted around it within a generation. In post-war France in 1947, the government imposed price ceilings on food to prevent inflation after wartime disruption. Farmers reduced production to the minimum required for their own consumption. The black market in Paris operated openly within months. The controls were progressively abandoned by 1949. In the United States in August 1971, President Richard Nixon imposed a 90-day freeze on all wages and prices. The first phase produced apparent stability. When the controls were relaxed in phases over the following 2 years, inflation erupted at rates that exceeded pre-control levels. The attempt to suppress the price signal had not resolved the underlying monetary pressure. It had stored it. Each of these episodes has the same architecture as Diocletian's edict. The supply side or monetary shock creates rising prices. The government interprets the rising price as the cause of the problem rather than the symptom of it. The government removes the mechanism by which buyers and sellers communicate about scarcity, the price, and replaces it with a number on a stone tablet, or a government gazette, or a presidential decree. And then the market goes underground, or goes silent. Here is what most people miss. The price is not a number. The price is a message. It tells a producer how much a consumer wants something badly enough to pay for it. It tells a consumer how scarce something is, and therefore how carefully to use it. When you cap the price below the honest cost of production, you send the wrong message to both sides. The producer hears, "Stop producing this." The consumer hears, "This is not scarce, use as much as you want." And within a short period, you have a shortage, where before you only had inflation. Inflation is painful. A shortage is catastrophic. You can survive paying twice as much for bread. You cannot survive there being no bread at any price. Diocletian's subjects discovered this in the winter of 301 to 302 AD. The soldiers the edict was designed to protect, because soldiers were paid in coin, and coin was losing value, and the edict was supposed to ensure that coin still bought things, found that the legal price guaranteed nothing, because at the legal price, the goods did not exist. The market had withdrawn, and a soldier with money and no market is not a satisfied soldier. He is a dangerous one. You do not need to reach back 1700 years to find this pattern. You need to reach back about 15. In 2003, Hugo Chavez began imposing price controls on food and consumer goods in Venezuela. The reasoning was identical to Diocletian's. Greedy producers and foreign speculators were exploiting ordinary Venezuelans. The government would protect the people by fixing the price of milk, flour, cooking oil, and beef. The prices were set below the cost of production to ensure affordability. Within 2 years, the controlled goods began disappearing from supermarket shelves. Producers could not operate at a loss indefinitely. Private farms reduced output. Food manufacturers cut production runs. The goods that were available only through state-run markets, which ran out regularly. By 2012, under Nicolás Maduro, the controls had deepened. Venezuela introduced the Cadivi system, a currency control combined with price control that made legal import of food effectively impossible at the official exchange rate. The black market filled the gap. Engineers and lawyers began smuggling pasta and rice across the Colombian border because the margins were better than their professional salaries. By 2016, Francisco Arias Cardenas, a provincial governor, told journalists directly, the shelves were empty and the people were demanding food. Maduro allowed some provinces to relax the controls as an experiment. In those provinces, prices rose. Empty shelves refilled. Ana Atencio, a nurse interviewed by the Wall Street Journal in those provinces at the time, said this, "At least I can come in and buy, even if at high cost. Before, I would not even dream of it, because of the line and people fighting." She was describing exactly what Lactantius described in 302 AD. The legal price guarantees nothing. The honest price, painful as it is, guarantees supply. Maduro did not apply the lesson nationally. The controls remained. By 2019, Venezuela's inflation rate reached 2 million%. Not 200. Not 2,000. 2 million% in a single year. And the answer is not what they taught you in school. Because every time this story is told in a school, the version you hear is that Venezuela's collapse was a failure of socialism, or a failure of Maduro personally, or a consequence of falling oil prices. And all of those things contributed. But the specific mechanism that destroyed the supply of food, the mechanism that turned a painful inflation into a civilizational shortage, was the price control. It was the government's decision to remove the price signal and replace it with a decree. Diocletian did the same thing, and his empire was already in distress. The price control did not add to the distress gradually. It converted the distress into a collapse of market function. Traders who might have continued operating at a loss for a season made the calculation quickly. The risk of death for overcharging was equal to the certainty of bankruptcy from complying. Rational actors chose withdrawal. The United States tried it too. In 1971, the Nixon price freeze produced short-term apparent stability and medium-term inflation that was worse than what preceded it. In the 1970s, gasoline price controls produced the queues at American petrol stations that are still part of living memory for anyone over 60. And price was held below market. The petrol was held out of the market in response. You have lived through the 2021 to 2023 inflation cycle. You watched governments in multiple countries describe the cause as corporate greed. Greedflation, the headlines called it, and the proposed solution, voiced in serious policy discussions, was price controls on food, fuel, and energy. The stone tablet from Aphrodisias is sitting in a museum in western Turkey. The message carved into it 1700 years ago is still there, still legible. It did not work then. It did not work in Venezuela. It has never worked. Not once in 4,000 years. Here is the question you should be asking by now. If price controls have failed every single time they have been tried, across 4,000 years and dozens of civilizations, why do governments keep trying them? The answer is not stupidity. The answer is not ignorance. Diocletian was not stupid. Nixon was not ignorant. Chavez was not a fool who had never read a history book. These were men who understood power, and who understood something specific about the way power survives. When prices rise, people are angry. Angry people need an explanation. The true explanation: we spent too much, we debased the coin, we expanded the state beyond what the economy could support, is an explanation that points directly at the people in power. It is an explanation that says, we caused this. And no government in history has voluntarily offered that explanation when an alternative was available. The alternative is the merchant, the trader, the speculator, not the profiteer, the foreign importer, the corporate price gouger. The names change across the centuries. The function is identical. They are the visible, nameable, prosecutable face of a problem whose true origin is invisible, systemic, and governmental. Diocletian's preamble to the Edict is worth reading carefully. I wrote that greed races forward without restraint. That wicked men rush to augment their profits not by years, nor by months, but almost by hours. That the soldiers, the honest servants of the state, are being robbed of their pay by the malice of traders the moment they leave the camp. He wrote this while simultaneously operating a state apparatus that had expanded the administrative class fivefold and was debasing the coin to pay for it. This is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the mechanism Diocletian used is not a historical curiosity. It is a permanent feature of how monetary crises are managed politically. You inflate, or you overspend, or you allow the structural conditions for price increases to develop. You wait for the public anger. You name a villain. The villain is not you. The villain is visible in the market. You announce a remedy: price controls, windfall taxes, anti-gouging legislation that is targeted at the villain you have named. The remedy does not address the cause. It addresses the anger. For a period, the anger is redirected. The cost is paid by the market, not by the government. Merchants go out of business or go underground. Supply contracts. The shortage that follows is attributed to the greed of those same merchants for hoarding, not to the controls that made selling unprofitable. A new villain is named. A new remedy is announced. Scholar Robert Schwettinger documented this cycle across 40 civilizations. His conclusion was that price controls function not as economic policy, but as political theater. They allow governments to appear to act decisively against a crisis, while avoiding the structural changes that would actually resolve it. The populations who suffer most are always the ones the controls were announced to protect. The Roman soldiers, who could no longer buy food at the legal price, were the people the edict was designed to help. The Venezuelan families who could not find milk or flour, were the people the controls were designed to protect. The pattern is not a coincidence. It is the mechanism. You are not a Roman soldier. You are not a Venezuelan nurse queuing outside an empty supermarket. But the mechanism that emptied those markets is not confined to ancient empires or failed socialist states. It is the mechanism that governs what happens to your money. Between 2020 and 2023, the money supply in the United States increased by approximately 40% in 3 years. The European Central Bank expanded its balance sheet by a comparable proportion. The Bank of England did the same. This was not a secret. It was announced policy. The governments of the developed world created money at a rate that had no peacetime precedent. And then, when inflation arrived, because it had to arrive, because the relationship between the quantity of money and the price of goods is not ideology, it is arithmetic. The explanation offered was corporate greed. Greedflation. The supermarkets were accused. The energy companies were accused. The food manufacturers were accused. The coin was not mentioned. You were not told that the 40% expansion of the money supply was the primary driver of the 40-year high in consumer prices. You were told that the people selling you things had decided, simultaneously, across every sector, in every country, to become greedy at the same moment. Diocletian made the same argument in 301 AD. He called it the madness of unrestrained prices. He did not mention the denarius. This matters to you directly, because when you do not know the true cause of inflation, you cannot protect yourself from it. You cannot make the correct decision about your savings, your investments, your employment, your debt. You are navigating with the wrong map. The Roman market did not vanish because Diocletian was evil. It vanished because the information system that the market depends on, the price, was destroyed by decree. And you live inside an information system too. Information you receive about why prices are rising, and who is responsible, what the remedy is, shapes every financial decision you make. If you believe the merchant is the problem, you support the price cap. If you believe the coin is the problem, you make different choices. You hold a different kind of asset. You think about money differently. You understand that the number on your bank statement is not a fixed measure of value. It is a unit of account issued by an institution that has expanded it by 40% in 3 years. Diocletian's subjects who understood what was actually happening. The ones who recognized that the denarius was worthless and traded in gold instead, survived the crisis with their wealth intact. The ones who trusted the official price and the official coin lost everything. The stone tablet at Aphrodisias is not a museum piece. It is a mirror. Here is what we know. In 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian issued the most ambitious price control in recorded history. 1,200 caps, 42 stone tablets, death for any violation. Within 4 years, it had collapsed. The markets withdrew. Blood was shed over trifling goods. The edict was rescinded from sheer necessity. And the inflation it was meant to stop continued, accelerating through the 4th century until 1 pound of gold cost 33 billion denarii, where it had once cost 60,000. The price edict did not fail because Diocletian lacked authority. He had absolute authority. It did not fail because the penalties were too mild. Death is not a mild penalty. It failed because prices are not the cause of inflation. They are the measurement of it. And when you destroy the measurement, you do not destroy the inflation. You destroy the market. This is the answer to the question planted at the start of this video. Diocletian knew the coin was the problem. He had tried to fix the coin and failed. When the monetary reform failed, he had two choices: acknowledge that the state's own expansion had created the crisis, or blame the merchants. He chose the merchants. Every government since has made the same choice when the coin has failed, and the political cost of honesty was higher than the political cost of a scapegoat. The edict was rescinded. The pattern was not. In Venezuela, the shelves emptied. In Nixon's America, the petrol queues stretched for blocks. In Hammurabi's Babylon, the market adapted around the decree within a generation. In every case, the sequence was the same. And in every case, the people who paid the price were the ones the controls were designed to protect. The edict on maximum prices is not a lesson about ancient Rome. It is a lesson about what happens when any government, in any century, in any country, under any political system, decides that the answer to a monetary problem is to silence the people who are accurately reporting it. If you found value in this, subscribe to The Money Architect. Every video on this channel forensically reconstructs a financial event, the way the people who lived through it actually experienced it, not the version that protects the institution. The version with the numbers. Leave your answer to today's question in the comments. Your government told you the cause of recent inflation was corporate greed. Did you believe them? And if you did not, what did you do about it? History does not repeat. But if you do not understand it, it will crush you all the same.